So yesterday I was watching the PBS NewsHour and they interviewed Vivek Ramaswamy, an Indian American candidate for US president, and it was interesting to watch, not just because of the, I'll say, creative way that he employs fascistic rhetoric while not going all the way into it, so there's some plausible deniability. Of course, he can get away with that as a man of color. Uh, or because of his rise in this crowd of candidates with zero political experience. I'm not going to talk about that. He's an interesting guy. But what I do want to talk about is statistics, more particularly the way that the right and the left seem to approach them. Because there was this interesting moment in the interview when the reporter for PBS NewsHour correctly brought up, I believe it was the share of the impoverished population of African Americans, who, despite comprising 13% of the population, make up around 24% of the impoverished population. I think that was the statistic that she brought up. And of course, Vivek Ramaswamy, being the self-made entrepreneur, so to say, that he is, brought up a personal responsibility of the parents of these people. He countered with another statistic, the amount of fatherless children that there are in the US who are African American. And I believe that hovers around 48%, or at least 48% of them live in a household headed by a single parent. This has been a common talking point for a long time. Not that I don't think fatherlessness shouldn't be addressed, but it has been used as a way of pushing aside other statistics. But hey, at least he used one. And I think there's a tendency on the right to dismiss any statistics whatsoever when brought up by the left as meaningless, because those people in that statistic just made bad choices that they could easily resolve by making different ones. Any attempt by the left to use these statistics to illustrate a broader point would be seen as breaking down this concept of free will, of disagreeing with this concept of free will. Leftist intellectuals will defend that broader concept, but will say that it exists within certain parameters, that it is not reasonable to truly expect people to make better and more informed choices when they do not have enough to eat, when they live in a neighborhood where they are surrounded by people making bad choices. This idea that your environment socially and the things that you put in your body health-wise greatly affect your brain and psychology is supported by science. If we were to discount those realities, we would be discounting the entirety of sociology, psychology, even neuroscience, to some extent. It wouldn't make sense. But that's what a lot of these people do, because they truly believe that if you just made different choices, you would get ahead in life, and that nothing external affects you and your behavior. And so the right will only use statistics insofar as they support their narrative that at least someone down the line made a bad choice, and that choice, individual responsibility, is really at the helm of all of our problems. This is not how conservatives in other countries speak. Even just in neighboring Canada, you regularly hear the conservative or Tory leader there bring up statistics to illustrate socioeconomic problems. This is kind of a uniquely American issue. But it's a prescient one. It's a pertinent one. Because I think it speaks to something more endemic to the left and the right on a psychological level, that the left in this country are much more open to the idea that we don't make choices all the time, or that when we do, it is within certain parameters, that we cannot will certain things into existing that don't exist. We cannot will ourselves into a better environment, into having better friends, better family, better food. And we cannot will ourselves into thinking better when we're not eating better. That's why you see in blue states like Minnesota the introduction of free, nutritious lunch programs, whereas the Republican politicians in those states will counter with not everybody should get a free ride. There's a stark difference in the rhetoric employed by these two different sides. One is saying that we need to lift up our poor neighbors, or the poor people in our cities and states, because their productivity affects all of us. Their ability to be productive in this country improves the economy and improves our lives. And they make the case for their policies by saying, this is a problem that exists, and it's a problem that is caused by externalities that we can solve by providing economic assistance in the form of food, in the form of housing, in the form of investment, in the form of education. It's a long-term plan. It's a long-term plan that is based on statistics that show that people are hurting, that people have these issues in their environment. And the idea is that by resolving those environmental problems, those socioeconomic problems, those externalities, we would enter a more prosperous society by having a more productive and educated workforce. A rising tide lifts all boats is a short and sweet phrase that would sum up that philosophy. But the right, on the other hand, would lead you to believe that all of these socioeconomic problems are non-existent, or they're merely caused by the individual, and that if the individual just worked hard enough, tried hard enough, and got themselves into a better situation, everything would be resolved. It's almost like this notion that you can teach anybody anything, or anybody can teach themselves anything. Never mind the fact that brains literally develop differently in, for example, abusive households, or in households where there's poor nutrition. These people's brains are not formed in the same way. And so the left, of which I am a part of, would say you've got to do something there. You've got to address the root causes of these problems. But in this way, the right is allergic to statistics. And you'll see them pull them out when it fits their narrative, only to then accuse the left of doing the exact same thing. When in reality, the left is just acknowledging the mere existence of entire fields of academic study that have existed for centuries and decades. They're playing a totally different ballgame. And what I would like to see is for this divide to not be so stark, for maybe the left to acknowledge a little bit more that yes, some things are individual choices that we make, some things are mistakes that we make. And the right to acknowledge, yes, externalities exist, socioeconomic realities exist, and they affect our world today. There needs to be something here in the middle that we can talk about. Because when I see politicians talk with one another in Canada or European countries, it does not sound like this. These guys and these guys are not this far apart. They're more like over here. Because at least they can agree on a basic set of facts. But what we have in America today are two sides battling one another with completely different visions of how even basic aspects of reality function. And I do not know how such a stark divide could ever be tenable for a nation, much less for the healing of a nation.